Ocular by Iniquity. Chapter 6. He awoke feeling very queer indeed. He did not want Lawrence to know he was awake, so he laid in his cot. Still, he turned over the words in his mind and thought about what Lawrence had said. To want to improve one's legacy was not selfish, but if it meant leaving Lawrence... He had never felt so opposed to self-promotion before. To be the best, he would have to work the hardest. He had not been given his position out of favoritism, and he would not keep it if he did not provide excellent service. He would never lead men onto the field if he did not prove it would be foolhardy to not give him that position. He wasn't there yet. He could not allow himself to be stopped by anything. He had to be relentless, unceasing, unending. He would have to stamp himself so clearly over this cause that he could not be denied his place in history. He had to show that he would never stop marching. But what it must have looked like when Lawrence saw his body. Alexander knew his self-improvement would come at the cost of other men. He knew that he would have to create his position by carving power away from men who deserved it less. They were in a war. He had killed other men to elevate his standing and promote his cause. He was not blind enough to pretend that others would go unharmed in the rise to power that he was destined to embrace. But Lawrence was different. Lawrence was not undeserving of what Providence gave him. Lawrence fought and earned his status. Lawrence had earned his respect and enough standing with him to sit in his heart next to the dream of independence. To hurt Lawrence in the quest to improve his legacy was unfathomable. And yet he seemed to be doing so. But there was work to do. But if he had hurt Lawrence... He squeezed his eyes shut and gathered himself. He could sense the darkness in the tent and the chill weather creeping in on them from all sides. He didn't know what time it was, but the noises of the camp had greatly settled. Lawrence? No. He opened his eyes. Lafayette was sitting in Lawrence's chair, peering at him. In the man's lap was his coat, his fingers wrapped around a needle in mid-sew. 2 sad candles had been placed on the table next to his chair to provide light for his work, and they cast an odd glow on his face. Where is Lawrence? Lafayette shrugged and resumed sewing. Alexander frowned and slowly sat up. A wave of dizziness hit him. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath to try and center himself. He could clearly imagine this conversation in his head. Lafayette, can you march this fool for me? Oui, but is he not your fool? Yes, and I cannot bear to be around him in this present time. He needs not to know where I am when he wakes. Lafayette, Alexander said, I fear I may have upset my Lawrence. Now what could a man of your great brilliance and quick wit have done to upset another? Lafayette asked dryly. He had clearly been already briefed on the situation. Hamilton ignored the tone of his voice and continued. He does not understand how much there is to be done. How can I explain to him that without completing these tasks, I can never be more than what I am now? Lafayette admired his work in the silent candlelight and then put the coat on, secreting the needle somewhere. But Lawrence is too intelligent to not understand the task ahead of us, he continued, filling the space left by the other man's silence. He must know there is work to be done, but then why would he be so upset at my attempts? He... and you must know that I do not work to hurt him. He is too smart to misinterpret my actions in such a manner. The Frenchman studied him for a long moment in the flickering light. The dark worry lines around his eyes and the shadows cast on his face made him look much older than Alexander knew him to be. Then he picked up both candles and sat down next to Alexander's cot. He watched him in the same knowledgeable thoughtfulness that Alexander remembered from yesterday. I fear you are withholding something about Lawrence from me, Alexander said finally, the frown deepening. You look as if you wish to say something unpleasant and do not wish to upset me. Has he confided in you? Lafayette looked away from him and into the stubby candles. Lawrence cares about you very much, Hamilton. And I him. This is not a secret. I do not know why you seem so hesitant about providing this information to its subject. He did not manage to keep all of the irritation out of his voice. How can you be so upset if a man does not want to see you die? One must be willing to die for the cause. Lawrence insults me by protecting me like a schoolchild. I do not believe the concern is that you will die in battle, mon ami. I believe he is worried you will die from your fever doing something only you would be doing, because any sensible creature will be resting, and while you are brilliant and a remarkable orator, I believe you to be born without a shred of decent sense. Alexander opened his mouth to take offense, but Lafayette continued. And if I may add, dying from a fever will probably only result in a small alleyway being named after you. I require a boulevard, Alexander retorted. Lafayette smiled at him, but it never reached his eyes. It was a dark kind of smile that stirred concern in Alexander's chest for his friend. Did he tell you he saw your body on my horse? A nod. Mon Dieu, I will never forget his face. It was as if a wraith had snuck behind him and slit his spirit from his body in one cut. He looked pale as he relived the memory, eyes distant. He grabbed your hand and squeezed as if to break your fingers. He looked at me like... He trailed off, looking into the candlelight and letting the silence hang. Then he spoke again, in French this time, with a quiet seriousness that kept Hamilton rapt and forced him to listen. If you are to die, Alexander, we will lose 2 good men. There is nothing more important to him than you. I do not mean this to speak ill of him, but I am the general. Do not believe Lawrence would be valuable to our cause with a broken heart. And to fault him for behavior he shows only because he came so terribly close to losing the thing he holds most dear. You should not do it. You should be honored the man cares so greatly for you that his fear of a world without you overrides all other thoughts and actions. Hamilton held the Frenchman's gaze in the semi-darkness. The sound of the wind ruffled the tent and deepened the quiet when it left. He cared for me when I was unconscious. I do not overstate when I say God sent an angel to look after you. Thank you, Lafayette. Lafayette gave him an odd smile. I am not the one who squeezed water droplets from a frozen towel into your mouth, or wiped sweat from your brow for hours. Alexander closed his eyes and tried to remember these events. He had 4 missing days he could not account for. He remembered being in the cold March. He remembered the storm. Then he remembered waking up and nearly toppling the medical tent. There was nothing else there. He focused harder. He had been there. The days had passed. Something felt just out of reach, like dark clouds on the horizon. Something struck to him like heavy air, making his joints ache. When he reached for it, it pulled away, dissolving into nothing. Is it acceptable if I were to write while in the tent? He asked. Perhaps, Lafayette said, and he stood up and took his candles back to Lawrence's desk. Alexander put his thoughts to the side and looked over at his chair and desk. The usual pile of papers that not only covered his desk but spilled off all 3 sides onto the floor looked smaller than usual. Lawrence had been doing his work for him. He couldn't stop the frown from curling over his face, but perhaps indicating that he was upset with a reduced workload would dampen the seriousness of his apology for being selfish. He took a breath and steadied himself, studying the chair as he would any other opponent. He could feel Lafayette's gaze on him. He stood. His feet wobbled under him. He could not acknowledge that he felt weaker than yesterday, or that perhaps being out in the cold had some effect on him, which was only beginning to bubble up. He could not consider the possibility that he would not recover further. Perhaps you should sit. The evenness in Lafayette's voice failed to hide a note of concern, and the Frenchman sat at the edge of his chair, half out of the seat already. Luckily, I already have some skill in catching you before you hit the ground. I am fine, Alexander said, and he took one of the 2 steps required to get to his desk. He did not realize how far his desk was from his cot. Somehow, the cramped living space became expansive when he sought to cross it. He could make it. He surged forward, barely feeling the second step and pouring himself into his chair like a glass of whiskey. The effort surprised him. Just yesterday. Had it been yesterday? He had been able to walk for a few hours. But even sitting here in this chair, his legs felt weak. 2 steps had been an effort. I was better, he said, because he could feel Lafayette's judging gaze on him. The Frenchman got up, retrieved his blanket, and draped it around his shoulders. Overcoming an illness as dire as yours is not so easy. There is no reason for me to stop improving. He studied the piles of papers on his desk, trying to remember what he had been talking about. On the top of one pile was an anti-slavery essay he had been working on. That would be an easy one to consider. He skimmed the pages, trying to identify what he had been writing about. The words did not blur on the page if he focused on them. Only that you are only human like the rest of us, and the human body is not some musket to be repaired and reoiled with ease. If you are to be well again, I will be well again. Lafayette sighed. If you are to be well again, you must take care of yourself to the best of your ability in this cursed weather. All else is up to chance, the grace of God, and the strength of your heart. Alexander snorted in disdain and went to reach for his pen. His arm trembled. Only with effort did he manage to set it into his hand. He cast his eyes on his inkwell and focused. It would not be difficult to dip his pen. This was an act he had been undertaking since he had been a child. He reached. Lafayette caught the inkwell before it could spill all over and set it upright. Alexander dropped the pen in disgust and stared at his essay, unable to suppress a noise of frustration. There is no shame in being ill, mon ami. If I beg, will you permit me to help you back into your cot? Says the man who is perfectly capable of crafting his own letters, he retorted bitterly. S'il te plaît, Hamilton. Begrudgingly, he allowed Lafayette to help him back to his cot. Would it improve your mood if I were to go over some updated information from the General and Congress? I suppose so, said Alexander with a sigh. He could not ignore that despite just waking up, he already felt tired. It was embarrassing for him to think 3 steps and a conversation had worn him out, but ignoring the truth did not change it. He had one ear listening to Lafayette's update about where they were with Congress, which was never good. Somehow Congress had come under the assumption they could be a successful army with no food, no supplies, and no blankets. But the rest of his mind wandered back to the missing days. He remembered the storm and the eye, but outside from that there was nothing. He closed his eyes and racked his brain again. Lafayette lowered his voice, and his French created a rhythmic, relaxing background to him trying to remember. It seemed too close for him to be unable to access. He had to continue to reach.